No intro needed, but I've never done a podcast on my own, so we're going to see how this goes. But I'm answering a question because I got quite a few, but I'm going to answer a question. It's something that I've answered before in some way or another, but in a roundabout way, in an amended way. I've never gone into great detail about it, so I'm just going to take a few minutes right now to tell you about the question that was asked, which was, how did you start in woodworking? So, that actually starts way before I was born, and I'm not going to be boring and too crazy or anything. I'm just going to tell you a story. My grandparents on my dad's side were farmers, so I grew up in a very blue collar family even after that point. My grandparents, so I'm 37 currently in 2023, but my grandfather on my dad's side was born in 1905, and my grandmother was born in 1913. My grandfather did not know how to read or how to write, but my grandmother finished. It was either fourth or seventh grade. I don't remember exactly, but she didn't make it very far in school. They did labor. They were skilled farmers, and that's what they did. So my grandfather, obviously being a farmer, he had to have other skills, and he did a lot of blacksmithing, so a lot of metal smithing, and he also had to how to do certain elements of carpentry. So that kind of builds onto where we're going with this. Now, they had never owned their own property before, and they ended up eventually saving up enough money. Different time, huh? They didn't have much money coming up, but they were able to actually save up enough money to purchase a 3 acre tract of land north of Atlanta in a suburb. Well, now it's a suburb, I guess you'd say. Back then, it was just whatever it was, called in Johns Creek, Georgia. It used to be Alpharetta, Georgia. When I was born, it was Alpharetta, Georgia, and then it separated at a certain point in time when I was coming up and became Johns Creek. So they started off there when my dad was, I think, a teenager. So before that point, they had never owned property. They had never owned a house of any type. They rented, and they did kind of like a sharecrop situation to where they would farm land and then give part of it to the person who actually owned the land. And then that landowner could either keep it or sell it or whatever they wanted to do with it. Um, but I heard stories growing up of my grandfather plowing with a mule and everything, and all that crazy stuff. And that may seem foreign because I'm only 37, but what you have to realize is that my grandfather on my dad's side was born in 1905. My grandmother was born in 1913, which means that my grandmother had my dad when she was 40 years old. So he was the baby of the family by quite a large stretch. So there's like almost an entire generation gap of years in there, um, between like my dad and his closest sibling. When my dad was born, his oldest sibling was already 20 years old and already had a kid. So my dad had a nephew that was 1 year older than him. Crazy. So that's the probably the most confusing part of this, is trying to keep track of the genealogy, which isn't really important. But I said that for a specific reason. I said that because um, my grandfather had to learn certain elements of carpentry for things like barn building and that kind of thing, and maintaining the property and the house and all of that. And so my dad, growing up in that environment, had to learn certain things as well, and so did my two uncles that were older than my dad. So they had to do all of that and figure out stuff, because if you grow up blue collar, if you grow up without much, the only person that's around to fix things, mend things, and build things is whoever happens to be alive. So that's kind of, I think, where my dad started, because one of my uncles, who was a welder and machinist later in life, and repaired heavy equipment, that kind of thing, he took an interest in carpentry, but he also could not really expand on it, because he told me stories about that when I was growing up, of how he really wanted to learn woodworking. He really wanted to build furniture and stuff like that, but he didn't have the ability to do it because they didn't have money. And they didn't have the ability to have the equipment to do it. They had, rudimentary tools, but nothing that would, be of a caliber to build furniture and do the things that he wanted to do. So he settled into machining and things like that, and working with steel and metal. And he was a maintenance technician, I guess you'd say, at a concrete block manufacturing facility, again, north of Atlanta in the suburbs. Um, so he did that instead, and he told me one time he tried to take a motor out of a refrigerator and build it into a table saw, which sounds very dangerous to me. But I do have stories from him like that, of saying how he wish he could have done that, but circumstances arise. You have a family. It was a different era back then because he started working full time in, the late 1950s, early 1960s. Things were way different. But luckily, my dad, growing up much farther away in age from them, was able to go to high school and take wood shop and things like that, which is, he'd watch his dad doing stuff, he'd watch his brothers doing stuff, and being kind of limited in those capabilities of what they're actually able to do. And my dad wanted to do more like fine woodworking. So I grew up in an environment where my dad was also a blue collar guy. He Most of my childhood was a warehouse manager, starting off at J.C. Penney when they had a catalog distribution center in Atlanta. Um, he was the warehouse manager there, expediting catalog orders and things like that. Very blue collar, very, just working man kind of situation. And then when J.C. Penney left the area and moved to another distribution center, I think it was in North Carolina or South Carolina, he didn't want to move. So instead, he took a job doing the same thing at a fastener company, nuts and bolts and things like that. But every weekend when I was a kid, when I was growing up, so that he could have more of a secondary income and just, keep himself, mentally well, I guess. Um, he would kind of go off to his workshop in the backyard. And I say workshop, but it was pretty much a shoebox. It was tiny. It was just a small building that used to be used just to store hay. Like, you could barely fit in this building, especially when you had things like table saws and a scroll saw and a miter saw. I have no idea now, looking at it, how he ever managed to do that and even make anything successfully in that type of shop, because I'm not even kidding. The ceilings were less than 8 feet tall. The whole shop itself was probably maybe 12 feet wide and maybe 24 feet long. It was a very, very small building, but that was all I could afford. That was all I could do. Um, but I grew up with him, waking up early on Saturday mornings after working a full week and going down there and just staying in the shop all day and working hard. He would make, curio cabinets and things like that. Dressers, whatever it would be, whatever people wanted. He would make tables. People would say that they wanted something, and then it would take him a very long time to make it because, he had church on Sunday and other obligations. So he only was able to do so much on a Saturday. And there were days that he would come in after work. He would get home at like 6 o'clock sometimes and then go, straight down to the shop, work for an hour or two, have dinner, go right back down there. I remember nights where I went to bed as a kid and he was still down there working and doing stuff. Um, but that, for me, it was the squished, compressed area that you could barely move in, making these things, and then the noises in those small spaces and stuff. Because he wasn't doing things like wearing hearing protection and all that kind of stuff. So you know his hearing isn't that great now, and I'm pretty sure that's why. But that whole environment, going down there as a kid, as like a 5, 6, 10 year old, whatever, going down there, seeing that, and like, oh, you come out of here just covered in sawdust and dirty and sweaty. Like, I don't want anything to do with that. I got, that's not what I'm interested in at all. And then when I was, especially when I was a teenager, or when I got a little bit older, I guess, say 13, 14, I was more interested in mechanical stuff. I was more interested in cars and working on cars and figuring out how cars worked. And I destroyed a lot of small engines trying to figure out how all that worked too. That was more of where my interests were. Eventually, he ended up leaving his business, or his warehouse job, and opening a business doing woodworking, sort of, with a friend of his doing commercial trim work. So they would go into businesses and offices and things like that, and they'd put baseboard, crown molding, all that stuff, door casings, window casings. They did that kind of stuff on a commercial scale. Just him and another guy, just still doing the blue collar thing, nothing crazy. And then that business eventually had to fold, and he built a shop, a bigger one, on the same property in my parents' backyard, right next to his old little teeny tiny shop, and set forth with trying to build another business doing cabinets and stuff. At that point in time, I was I was right out of high school, and I didn't really have a plan for the gap year that I was taking because I was going to go to school for theology, and I took a leap or a gap year from 2004 to 2005, where I wasn't going to school and I was just going to work. And he needed help at that time because he was still trying to establish his cabinet shop, his cabinet business, which he was running all on his own. And so he was taking kind of odd jobs here and there, which meant like renovating houses and building decks and all that kind of stuff that goes along with it. So, I have this gap year. So I took that point to kind of learn a little bit about his trade. And that entire year, I did work with him. I worked for him in the sweltering summer heat and the cold winter. And I learned a lot about the construction end of it, but not so much the finer woodworking end of it, the bespoke kind of stuff. I can build a deck, but I can't build a cabinet. But I also didn't really enjoy what I was doing. It was just more of a paycheck at that point because I had other goals, I had other ambitions for school. So it was more like I have to do this because I've been working in other jobs. I started off in a retail job when I was 15, and then I got an internship at Remax Greater Atlanta, and I was an intern for their closing attorneys for about 2 years, and then graduated from high school and then started working with him. So I was at least learning skills, even though it wasn't something that I was super interested in or something that I really wanted to do. Now, at that point, I also his business started to kind of slow down. He was trying to transition into the cabinets. He really wanted to just build cabinets, kitchen cabinets, and things like that. So in that transition, that meant that I didn't have a job because that was not something that I could do. And that was not something that he had the capacity to train me to do because he was just starting out. It was a very new thing. So I went to school, but during school, I still had to work full time. So I took a job as a restaurant server. I was doing a lot of volunteer work in a college ministry and was going back and forth from Atlanta all the time. So I had my own thing going on. I was doing 50 or 40 hours a week at the restaurant, doing another 5 to 10 in a ministry setting, and then going to school 9 to 12 hours depending on the workload, the semester load I was taking. So I had a lot going on during that period of '06 to whatever. He was just establishing himself and trying to create a cabinet business. And then I ended up in the golf industry for a few years at a lower level management kind of spot, and I thought that was where I wanted to be. And then I fell into alcoholism, which is something that is a completely different story that I'll have to get into later. But that is not the reason why I got out of that industry. I was laid off in 2011. I was working full time. I'd moved out of my parents' house, and I was still in school. And because I had to amend my schedule, I wasn't taking a full load anymore. So I was just kind of like building out of it slowly. 2011 rolls around, and I got laid off. And then sunk into a really bad alcoholism and depression and everything else that goes along with that. I had a really, really rough few years there that I'm sure some people saw on the outside and some people didn't. I'd like to think I was good at hiding it, but the more that you think you're good at hiding things like that, I think the worse you actually are at it from the outside looking in. So, like I said, that's a story for another time. I'll get into the details of that later. But what ended up happening there is I could not find a job in 2011. I had opportunities. I had people that I'd met and networked with through the club, the golf club that I worked for, that had offered me things over the years, and I didn't take them because, as far as I was concerned, I was just going to stick with golf and do that for the rest of my life. And I was not good at golf. I was good at the organizational end of it, but as a player, I was absolutely terrible. Um, but after all that happened and I could not find a job, and months went by and I couldn't do anything. I drained all my savings. I was just falling into an alcoholic depression slump, and just I had nowhere to go. My dad did reach out, and he said, why don't you come to the shop and put a few hours in here and there, maybe I can use you, then we'll see. So he was at that point still doing his cabinets out of the shop that he'd built a few years prior, and it was still just him. My two uncles had retired by that point, so they actually spent time in his shop just watching him work every day during the week. So um, that gave me an opportunity to get even closer to them. And going back to the stories that my uncles were able to tell me that I mentioned earlier, those all happened within that same time period. So I ended up working with him very sparsely, and I was picking up skills. At that time, I was also very unhealthy. I was at a very unhealthy weight for my body type because of the alcoholism and other circumstances happening. And by the end of 2012, I made a decision to get sober and try to figure out exactly what I needed to do in life, because I was slowly starting to appreciate the what woodworking was and the things that I had squandered. And if I had actually focused on these things when I was younger, it could have taken me farther. And I was finally coming to these realizations that if I had just given it a chance and hadn't written everything off so early, I might have been able to figure something out and go to a different place. So I said, you know what? Now I'm going to try. I'm actually interested in this. I'm going to see what happens. So I got sober. I started getting healthier. I was still struggling financially in a really, really bad way, but I was determined to figure it out. I spent every day during the week working with my dad and learning how to build cabinets, and then I would get advice from him on how to build other things in sort of in the way that he had when I was a kid. More fine woodworking, more furniture pieces. Um, Learning how to varnish and properly stand and seal things, and how to carve. Like, I was actually carving bow ties into wood. Like, I was doing intricate things. I was doing all of these, you know, like if there's a crack down a piece of wood down the grain and you want to save it, you carve what's called a bow tie out of that. You carve deep down across the crack and you put a bow tie in it that's made out of a different piece of wood to hold it back together. I was doing stuff like that, stuff that was extremely time consuming, but I was learning a skill and I was learning how wood actually worked, if that makes sense. You got to get a feel for things. Not everything is mechanical. Some stuff you really have to have a feel for it. You really have to pay attention and understand, like, if I cut into this in this certain direction and I see the way the grain pattern is going, then it might cause a split, or it might track the blade into a different direction. There's all kinds of stuff that you just figure out on your own as you do it, as you experience it, and as you screw up. So, starting in 2013, I was thinking that I could do something with actual furniture. This is early 2013. Still struggling at this point in many ways, but I would work all week with my dad, and he couldn't afford to pay me much, so it was not much at all because he wasn't making much. It was a really strange time economically for a lot of people in that era. Um, he would pay me whatever he could, and I would help him in the shop. I would paint stuff with the spray gun, and I learned how to paint, and I carry that even to this day because that's a skill in its own. But after doing a full week with him, I would then show up on Saturdays, because unless he had something really important, really pressing to do, he would not work on Saturdays. So I would show up on Saturdays and Sundays and set up my own stuff and work and sweat and try to finish as much as I could. And I made some, not to toot my own horn, but I made some really beautiful furniture pieces. And I was using whatever I could because I couldn't afford to buy my own materials. I was going through his old shop, which had then become a storage building of just like random chunks of hardwoods and stuff that he had picked up. And I was building tables out of it, and I taught myself how to weld because this is an era when like industrial style furniture was a big deal. So I learned to weld steel and do table bases, and I ended up making a whole lot of inventory. I didn't have anywhere to sell it, so I made a whole bunch of stuff over months and months and months of just trying. And I went to a furniture slash handmade type festival that was nearby. and it was like $75 entry or something like that to be a vendor there. And I borrowed a tent. I put down a rug, and I put out a bunch of furniture pieces that I'd made, and people came by and looked at my stuff, and they took my cards, and I didn't make any sales. It was a 2-day event. I sold nothing on day one, even though there was a lot of heavy foot traffic there. Um, I sold nothing on day two until right before everything closed down. A lady came in, walked up, and bought one of my tables. It was probably like $200. And I had been very sad, clearly, after almost 2 days of making no sales. But that may have pushed some other people away and been like, yeah, this really isn't worth it. But I was like, you know what? This can be worth it if I actually try. This can be worth it if I find my avenue, if I find kind of my voice, if I find where I need to be in this industry. I've just got to figure out what that is. And I don't think it's what I'm doing right now. So I kept pushing and trying to figure out, like, where do I fit in? Like, what do I do? So, after that failed attempt at selling furniture, I this again is in 2013. I had already established like a name for my company. It was J. Drew Fabrication and Design, which is still the technical name. Like, it's what I'm registered with. That is the name of my business. I just kept pushing and trying to figure it out and trial and error. And the first thing I made that actually sold when I opened an Etsy shop, the first thing that I sold on Etsy was a guitar hanger that I had designed with a nice dovetail corner. And that one thing kept me afloat for the rest of 2013. That one thing. And then I tried to expand on it, and I tried to keep selling my furniture and things like that. And then a friend of mine that I didn't really know, but our circles had connected at a few times, said, what about jumping into something like crystal and rock collecting? Because here's something I haven't mentioned, because that's when something clicked. That's when something made sense, when someone said, what about crystals and rocks? When I was a kid, 6 years old, 5 years old, and we would just go anywhere. If there was a gift shop or a rock shop, I would always go in there and I would want something. Whether or not we could afford to get it was another story, but I'd always spend time at rock shops if we ever had gone on like a weekend trip to Tennessee or wherever. I was always drawn to it. So when I was a kid, I collected rocks and minerals and crystals, and people for quite a few years there knew that was my thing. And so I would always get one for like a birthday or Christmas or whatever. Or sometimes my mom's friend would just surprise me and give me something that she found, because she's like, I think you would like this. And I never really gave much thought to it, but I'd always kind of kept that close to me. That was something that I always still gravitated towards, was the collecting rocks and pretty things. And the only reason I liked them was because it was pretty. And I'm like, I can't just go in my backyard and dig this up. I dug up a massive chunk of quartz when I was probably like 10 years old out of my backyard that I still have, that weighs like 15 pounds. That was my biggest like find up to that point. But this friend of mine was like, hey, why don't you try to make displays for people who collect? There is nothing on the market right now specifically catered to that audience that's distinctly different. And there are a few people that make things that are like that, but they're very much on the high end. They're on the upper end. They're well over $100, $150, $200, $300. What can you do with that? With that came my first crystal shelf design, which was it was a octagon. It was half of an octagon. Take an octagon, slice it in half, so it's kind of like a curved top wooden thing. Hard to explain, but I had already had an Etsy shop at that point to sell my guitar hangers, and she's like, why don't you put those on there and see what happens? And then they started selling, and then I started expanding, and I started doing other things, and I started, the first few years, everything I was doing was what you would call stick built. Stick built meaning you get a piece of material, you cut angles on it and stick it together to make a box or a hexagon or a triangle or whatever. And that was that was a market that I really jumped into, and before it was a big thing that like it seems like everybody and their cousin does that kind of stuff, which I don't blame them. I'm not saying like, oh, I was one of the original people who did that, so you can't do it anymore. Like it's simple stuff. People have been building geometric and triangle shaped shelves for longer than I've been alive, for sure. So it's just they weren't catered specifically to the crystal mineral collector enthusiast market. So I made it a point to kind of push in and market to that. Like I said, there were options for that at the time, but they were definitely more on the premium high end of things. And I wasn't going to rip anybody off. That was the thing. Because the most common thing that was kind of floating around at that point were triangle shelves. And it took me a year before I made a triangle because there was one other person that was really pushing bespoke premium triangle shelves that were at least $150 a pop. And I was not going to step on anybody's toes. So until I figured out a way to make a very distinct triangle, I didn't. I stayed as far away from that concept, that idea as I possibly could, until I realized that I needed to figure out a way to do one of my own that was distinctly different, a different angle, a different style, and put that out there. And then I kind of over the span of, through 2013 and 2014 into 2015, I finally in 2015 said, I'm going to build a triangle and see what happens. And then people started knowing me as the triangle guy. I didn't want to be the triangle guy. I wanted to be a carpenter. I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to be a maker. I didn't want to be the triangle guy. So I also, after that point, set apart to do something different and try to be something different from even that. Um, and I was very much at that moment, I was very much against any sort of automation. And by automation, I mean like laser engraving, which you're engraving things and cutting things with a pretty much a beam of light, or CNC, which is where you're cutting into wooden material or whatever material with a spinning blade on a router, so it's carving, removing material with a spinning blade. Um, I was very much against that because I was like, people who do that are cheating. Like you've got to do handmade, you've got to do bespoke, and then you know people started making more and more stick built stuff, just like I was, because it's really, if you have the equipment, if you have a couple saws and a nail gun and some glue, you can kind of figure it out. It's not that complicated. So I was like, well, I've got to do something different. I've got to figure out something different. I want to expand my skill set. I want to do more. So I was like, I can do these hand carvings like I was doing before with the tabletops and the bow ties and all that furniture I made that didn't sell. I can do everything by hand and take a ton of time and not make anything out of it because people won't pay for that these days, unfortunately, because I look at it and I'm like, it took me hours just to hand carve and install one bow tie inlay into a tabletop. Who's gonna pay for that? Like I couldn't even think of anybody that I would know that would be like, yeah, let's pay what you're worth to put forth all of that effort, and putting a hand carve inlay and something on top of everything else. Then I'm like, it's just not practical. It's in this era, it's something that if you have a very well established name, you may be able to do, but to actually make it sustainable and something that you can, form a business in and like expand, you can't. So I made a decision to purchase. I took out a small loan at this point in time in 2015. I had only um, recently, a span of 2 years went by of me doing this and saying, like, I'm doing this full time ish, but I'm still doing, I'm still working with my dad every day. Um, it wasn't until 2015 that I was finally able to be like, okay, I don't really need to work with my dad anymore. I can do something on my own. Like I'm to the point to where I'm kind of breaking even, so I'm okay. Those first 2 years, I tricked myself into not spending any money on myself. Every single dime I made for 2 years went right back into the company. I didn't have hot water in my house because my hot water heater broke 2 years earlier. So I'm taking cold showers and stuff like that. Which is not the end of the world, trust me. I've been to other places on mission trips and such where the norm is to not have a water heater. Like, I know that's like a, first world problem, whatever. I get it. But that's just an example of what was going on. Like, I was purposefully paying whatever minimal bills I had, but I was still not buying myself things. I was not buying myself clothes or anything. Like, I was wearing my clothes completely out, to the point to where my dad was just like, "I'm buying you some shoes because, you need shoes." And like that's literally how it was for 2 years. And it actually, going back to that moment meant a lot to me, actually. That something as simple as that, my dad recognizing that I needed help in a simple way of just like buying me a $40 pair of shoes. Like, that was a big deal to me, because at that moment I wasn't in a position to where I could do that for myself. As strange as that sounds, because I was trying so hard to build this business, my focus was entirely and completely on that. So, um, after after 2015, and I'm breaking even, and I told my dad, because I had slowly been kind of stepping out of it. I would take a day off a week, um, from his shop, and do stuff at home, because he had given me a secondhand miter saw. Um, I had bought a secondhand small, very small table saw off of Craigslist for like $50. My dad had given me a couple tools that he didn't use anymore, and I'd set up things in my basement to do that, and just trying everything I could to make that work, and not giving myself any bit of the revenue from that, because the revenue was really just enough to where I'm like, I just want to put it back in the business. I want to roll this in. I want to put this back in the business, because without this, I don't know what I'm going to do next, because I've spent all these years trying to make something work. Um, and then, being known as the triangle guy, and being able to expand what I was doing, one day I was like, I don't want to be the triangle guy. I don't, So that was when I decided, you know, at this moment, I'm against automation, but I'm going to try it, because I don't want to be pigeonholed. I don't want to be shoved into a box, and people think that you are just this one thing. You are the triangle guy. You're the guy who makes triangles. So I was able at that point to take out a PayPal loan of a few $1,000s, and it scared me so badly, because I was just so uneasy about it. But I had to do something to differentiate myself. I purchased a laser engraver, a small 50-watt machine off of eBay. I had no idea how to use it, no idea how it worked. I had zero experience with CAD, computer aided design. I had no experience with that at all. I knew nothing about it. I didn't have a computer that was capable of running it. So I took that couple $1,000s. I bought a laser, which was slightly better than the cheapest one that was on there, but not that much. And I bought a used computer, and did everything I could to teach myself how to do this stuff. And it was a struggle, and eventually I figured it out. And I was I kept that laser. I actually still have it. I still use it for some things at home. But that learning experience, I had no mentor in any of it. Like, up until that point, I had a mentor in my dad to teach me, how to do stuff traditionally in woodworking. As far as technology goes, nothing beyond a router and a table saw and a miter saw and you know, an oscillating sander. Like, that was the extent of it. But I was on my own. I was trying to carve out a niche. I was trying to be whatever I needed to expand into be, and I didn't have any idea what that was. I had no clue what I was going to do with this. I just knew that I needed to do something. Something had to give. So I imported this thing, and I spent a solid year and a half not knowing anything about anything, and screwing up and messing up, and frustrating myself. And eventually started to figure out how to do stuff, and I started expanding, and I started learning how to design things on the computer. And after about 2 years of using just a laser, I bought a small CNC machine. Again, that's the one with the spinning blade that moves around, and instead of cutting with the light beam, it carves. I got one of those, and then slowly built up and got a larger CNC machine. which I used for a long time. And that was when I got into the stuff that I became more known for than the triangles. That was when I was able to break out of the triangle thing. I was able to make things that weren't, angles that were nailed together. I was able to make stuff that looked more sculpted and more compound curvature and that kind of stuff. But I'm all self taught. Everything I know about anything that's CAD related is just what I figured out on my own. I could probably do well with taking a class to learn more and get further into it, and I've considered that I may actually do that one day. Um, but if you had told me, looking back now at almost a decade ago and where I was at that point in time, and you would have said at some point you're going to know how to design stuff in a CAD system and you're going to know how to make stuff that's completely different from what this is. You're going to figure something out that's going to at least sustain you for a few years and you're going to be all right for a while. If you had told me that 10 years ago, I'd have been like, you're crazy. I'm nothing but an alcoholic with no motivation and no drive to get anywhere. That was what I was in that era. But I was able to try and push and get somewhere. Now, is that permanent? Is that where I'm going to be the rest of my life? I don't know. Is this what I'm going to do forever? I don't know. I could, in the next couple of years, the next year even, I could go off and do something completely different because I'm always aware that everything that I've done so far has the ability to collapse and fall apart around me at any moment. I'm not naive enough to think that anything is permanent because I've lost everything before and I've had to rebuild. So I get it. I understand. I understand that nothing is infinite, that life is just full of a bunch of finite circumstances. And all I can do is prepare the best that I can to get wherever I'm going to end up. And, now I have a lot of machinery. I have two very large, very powerful, very expensive lasers. I still have a full-size CNC machine. I still have tools and equipment. I have the knowledge of how to do computer aided design. I know how to set up that very interesting type of machinery that I use. I know all this now. But I also tried to set myself up in a way to where if this creative, artist centric, everything that has consumed me the past decade, if this does all fall apart tomorrow, I would hope I have an exit strategy. I would hope that the things that I've learned, the machinery that I've acquired, and teaching myself to reinvest as much in my business as I can before I pay myself has made it to where if I've got to do something to survive that I don't particularly enjoy, but that's the only way I'm going to survive, like do things that I don't like make signs for businesses that I don't want to do because I don't find any joy in that particularly. I like to design stuff and make stuff that's in my own head. I don't like to, make other people's stuff and do their vision. That's not what I'm into. I have so many ideas and concepts in my own head that I would like to get out there before I do anything, related to what someone else's creative ideal is. But if I have to do that to get somewhere, I would like to think that I've set myself up to the point that I can, if I don't have a choice. So there was always a long game with it. There's always a game plan. I love woodworking. I love carpentry. But I also have an exit strategy if it gets to the point to where I've got to do something that I don't particularly enjoy just to survive. I would hope that I have set everything up enough to where I can be there and exist there as long as I have to before I do find joy in something else. If that ever happens. I hope it doesn't. I would love to just continue doing things in the trajectory that I'm on for the rest of my life. Like that's the ideal situation. I want to be a carpenter. I want to be a woodworker. But if it comes to the point to where I can't anymore, I at least tried to set it up to where I can do something else, even if it's not something I particularly like doing. But that's my journey thus far. So, not to keep it too long-winded or anything, I'm going to break it off right there. So, I don't know if that was as particular as whoever asked those questions wanted it to be, but that's my story so far. I want to be an artist, I want to be a maker, I want to be a woodworker, and I intend to try and push that as hard as I can. And getting here was not the most fun process, but I would not trade it for the world because everything good that has happened in my life the past 10 years has been revolving around the experience of artistry and woodworking and continuing sort of a family legacy of sorts. So I hope you got something out of that. I hope you enjoyed something that had to do with that. But I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you soon.